Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio, and today I'm going to be reviewing Dice Hospital ER Emergency Roll from designers Matthew Dunstan and Brett J. Gilbert and publisher Alley Cat Games. In Emergency Roll, you are running a hospital, and every round, different patients are going to be coming into your hospital, represented by dice, on ambulances, which are represented by cards. This is a roll and write type game. That's the theme anyway. Let's head over to the table. I'll show you how the game plays. Then we'll come back here and I'll give you my final thoughts. All right, here we have Dice Hospital ER Emergency Roll, the roll and write game set in the world of Dice Hospital. In the game, you are going to have your own hospital that is represented by this sheet of paper where you are going to be admitting patients, which are represented by these 3 dice. One player is going to be the chief physician in each round, and this will pass clockwise around the table, round by round, so that every player is going to be the chief physician a number of times during the game. The timer for the game is going to be when this stack of ambulance cards, there are 24 total here. The game comes with 27. You randomly remove 3 at the beginning of the game. When those cards run out, that's going to trigger the end of the round. When you're playing a 5-player game, you actually only remove 2 cards, but every other player count, it'll be 24. So what you're going to do on a turn is you are going to flip over the ambulance card. This is the chief physician, and they're going to roll the dice and they're going to place them in the corresponding ambulance. So you've got the red, yellow, and the green. And so you just roll the dice and place them in their corresponding spot. Then the chief physician is going to choose one of these dice and its associated bonus, and they are going to make it known which one they are taking. So perhaps you're going to take this red 6, and then you're going to write that number, trigger the bonus. The other players around the table will choose one of the other 2 dice and its associated bonus simultaneously. So that's something that can be done in simultaneous play order. There are some ways to mitigate the dice that I'll talk about here in a moment, but that's generally the flow of a round. Flip over the card, roll the dice, assign them to their particular spots and their associated bonuses. So, as you might expect, there are some rules on how you can place dice. If you look at the sheets here, there are these little boxes that are kind of bed, I think they were called bed spaces, and those are your starting spaces. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 starting spaces that correspond to different wards. And so if you see, this is a ward, this is a ward, this is a ward. They all start at a bed and end at a particular nurse. And the longer they are, obviously, the higher points that they can potentially gain you at the end of the game if you have been able to completely fill that ward. All right, this one is only worth 4 because it's only 3 spots. The rules for placement are simple. The first die in a ward has to go in its bed space. If you're going to continue that ward, it has to be a number higher than the one that was there before. So let's say, for example, that I had a 1 here, and I wanted to draft that green 3. I could place it here because it is a green spot, and it's a number that's higher than the one before it. I could put the 3 right there, okay? It can't be the same value or lower. It has to be higher, all right? So if it has a color, you have to place that color die there, and it always has to be a number that is higher than the one before it, all right? As I mentioned, there are also some bonuses that go along with these. So let's just kind of talk about a few of these. This bonus is going to allow you to draw a circle around any patient that is furthest along in one of these wards, and that basically is going to reset that ward for you. So if I took it on this one, I could circle the 3, and now the next die in there could be of any value because it kind of resets it, okay? This is what's called a critical patient, and when you draft that die, you're going to put an exclamation point next to it, And at the end of the game, so if I took that yellow die, maybe I placed it here. Again, keeping in mind, these wouldn't all be going on the same board, but just to show you, I could put a 1 here because it's a yellow spot, and then I put an exclamation point. And at the end of the game, you're going to add up all of your critical patients together to get you some points. This just gains you a blood bag. So that's a good time to talk about blood bags. You don't start the game with any. When you get them, you just simply circle them. This is a mitigation method. When you choose to use a blood bag, you would just cross it off once you've received one, and that's going to allow you to do one of two things. Either it's going to allow you to choose the die and the bonus that the chief physician did. Normally you cannot do that. If you cross off a blood bag, you can. Or it allows you to ignore the color requirement placement in one of your wards. So it would allow you to perhaps place a red or yellow die in this green spot. So that's what the blood bags do. You also see these stethoscopes here. You start the game with 1. When you get a stethoscope bonus, you actually circle 2 of them, and they just allow you to add or remove 1 to the value of a die that you're going to place in a ward. It can't wrap around from a 1 to a 6. There are some other bonuses here. As I mentioned, are the stethoscope bonuses. And here's another one. This is the nurse bonus, okay? So the way the nurse bonus works is that you would draft the die that goes with it, and then whichever ward you place that die into, let's say I was going to place it into this ward here, which is a green spot. So I place this 3 here. If you take the nurse bonus, what you're going to do is cross off the nurse in that ward, so they cannot score, you cannot score those points at the end of the game, but you circle the leftmost uncircled spot down here on your nurse track. And you're going to score at the end of the game the furthest along point value there. So you're losing some points here, but you're potentially gaining points here depending on how you do it. So you're going to continue to do this, flipping over cards, rolling dice, assigning dice, placing them into your area. Actually, there's one more bonus here that I did not. This is an extra patient bonus, and what this allows you to do is, in addition to the dice that you draft that goes with it, you have to place a second one, a virtual value 1 or 2 red patient, and it can go either in the same ward that was associated with the die that you placed or in a different ward. You're going to continue to do this until this deck runs out. At the end of the game, you're going to score points for, as you might expect, a number of different things, and they are listed along here at the bottom. You're going to score points for all of the nurse bonuses that you would get for completing a ward. If you'd gotten all the way across here, if you didn't cross it out, in this case, you get those 5 points. You add those up and you put them here. You're going to get points for the critical patients that you have placed throughout the game. You're going to get points for the furthest along on this nurse track you're going to get. And then you're going to get 3 potential bonuses that you have claimed, 3 in the game, actually 2 in the game, 2 at the end of the game. So you randomly are going to draw 2 cardiologists. There are a few of them in the game. And these are going to be, actually they should be flipped to this side, apologies. These are going to be goals that you're trying to reach throughout the game. So the first player that gets 4 blood bags would get those 8 points. They would flip this over and every other player would get 5 points. In this case, the first player that had gotten 3 nurses would get the 8 points. They'd flip it over, everyone else would get 5. If you achieved those, they would be placed right here. These are endgame cards, the radiologist and the epidemiologist cards. Again, those are random. There are a number of different ways that these can score. The radiologists all deal with these 2 lab spaces here. So you've got these 2 laboratory spaces in your hospital. And this particular card would give you 2 points for every die that is adjacent to this that is of a value 4 or higher. This epidemiologist is, again, one of a number of different possibilities. And what this one is saying is that at the end of the game, you're going to score 3 points for whatever value you have represented the most on your sheet at the end of the game, and you're going to lose 3 points for whichever one you have represented the least, okay? There are also 4 potential morgue spots, which basically means if you cannot or choose not to place a die, you would circle that off, and those are negative points at the end of the game. You would add all of those across, figure out what your final score is. Whoever has the highest score wins Dice Hospital Emergency Roll. Let's head back over and I'll let you know what I think. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea on how the gameplay for Emergency Roll plays out. As I believe I mentioned in the overview, this is a roll and write version of a game that came out a couple of years ago called Dice Hospital. But it's a very different game, different designers, but set within the same kind of thematic world, I suppose, where you are running a hospital. So the first thing I want to do is talk about some benchmarks. These are some high-level things that I like to consider when I'm deciding whether to get a game off the shelf or not. The first is setup and teardown, and with this being a roll and write type of game, there's not a whole lot of setup and teardown to it. It's very simple. Everyone gets a sheet, they get a pencil, and you get some cards. But it's very, very quick to set up and play, as you would expect in a game of this genre. So no issues there, very quick to set up and tear down. The next thing that I want to discuss is rules. And this is a bit of a mixed bag, this area. Overall, I felt like the rules were well written. They did a good job, especially of being specific when there were potential timing issues with how bonuses trigger and things along those lines. So there were a number of times that we had questions in the game of, oh, can you do this first or not? And when we looked in the rule book, it was addressed there. And so that's a big positive. I don't believe there were any times that we had a question that was not answered directly in the rule book. So that's a big positive. But on the negative side is that there are no player aids at all in this game. And this is a game that could really definitely benefit from a player aid. You know, one per player would be ideal, but even just a central player aid there on the table would be nice. I suppose you could use the rule book, which some people at the table were using. And if you played the game many, many times, I assume you would internalize many of these things. But you can't really make that assumption in a game like this where there are lots of different bonuses and effects. A player aid would be very, very helpful, especially since there's not a lot of UI help on your player sheet, and that's something I'm going to talk about here in a moment. Next thing I like to do is talk about art and components. First, I'm going to talk about some issues that I had, and then I'll talk about something that, you know, the things that worked for me. First is a big negative, and to me, it's honestly a big issue for this game, and that is that the actual graphic design of the player sheets themselves, I felt, were remarkably poor. And you might have been able to ascertain that watching the overview. There are distinct wards within this hospital that are essentially tracks, but they don't go in straight lines. They kind of meander throughout this hospital. And they did a very, very poor job of delineating one ward from the next. They're basically these thick black lines, but it is very, very hard to tell at a glance easily which ward you're placing into. Like, you're always constantly having to trace back from your bed to the nurse to figure out, okay, which ward am I going into here? It would have been such an easy fix. There are so many ways they could have handled this, and it's very surprising to me that it didn't get caught during play testing, during the quality control when they're putting this together. I cannot imagine this was just a problem for me and the people that I played the game with. Really, honestly, as soon as I read the rules and was looking at the sheets, I was thinking, boy, this is going to be really difficult. I thought maybe in practice it won't be that tough. It was. It was that tough. So that's really a big problem. Kind of circling back to what I mentioned a moment ago in the benchmarks is that there also, in addition to not being any player aids, there's not a lot of UI help, user interface help on the player sheet. So where you've got the bonus sections or the mitigation sections like the stethoscopes or the blood bags, there's no indication at all to kind of remind you what they do. So even if you don't have a player aid, it would have been nice to have a little +1, -1 next to the stethoscopes. Not a big deal, but it would have been nice. Some kind of simple iconography by the blood bags to remind people what they can do. There is extra space on those sheets, and much of it was taken up with art, which the art is fine. And that being a part of this, I did like the kind of the look of the game, the look of the characters and things like that. But I would have happily sacrificed some of that on the player sheets for more usability help for the players, because it needed quite a bit of it. The card quality, as I mentioned before, was good, and I do like, again, the look of the art in the game. There's not a lot of art in the game, especially on the cards, but that's fine. It makes them very usable, very kind of easy to see what's what. But again, I would have sacrificed some of that nice art for better usability. Okay, so overall gameplay. First off, I'll talk about the things that I liked and the things that I did not like. On the positive end is that this did have some good turn angst, which is something that you're looking for in a game like this. You know, there were many, many times where you're very much hoping that a particular die is left to you or is available to you, or you don't have to spend a blood bag to be able to use what the chief physician is going to take. So that was good. You're engaged every single round, and that's a positive thing. The simultaneous drafting means that there really is no downtime, because even when you're not the quote-unquote active player, you're still going to be drafting a die. You're still going to be placing into your sheet. You're actively engaged on every player's turn, and so that's a positive. Now to the negatives. I think that you have to look at roll and write games that are being released now within the context of how many of these types of games are now in the market and how many of them continue to get released. Is it fair to have a game be negatively impacted because it doesn't stand out from others in the genre? I believe the answer is yes, and I think that's a big problem with this game, is that I don't really feel like Emergency Roll does anything to stand out in this genre. There's a lot of roll and writes out there. This is a perfectly reasonable one. It doesn't feel unbalanced. Those types of kind of mathematical underpinnings, the design work, that part is solid. But I was looking for some hook, some kind of ingenuity, something original that was going to make me go, okay, that's interesting. I haven't seen that before. Literally nothing that I didn't feel like I had seen somewhere else in some other roll and write game. And so that's a problem. It felt very by the numbers. The way you mitigate the dice, yeah, I've seen that before. The bonuses at the end of the game and during the game, yeah, I've seen those before. Nothing that really stood out to me as being unique, innovative. And I do really feel like you have to, in a crowded space, stand out in some way. All right. And the other negative is that some of those end game scoring cards are pretty tedious. It was, for example, the one that I showed you in that overview, where you have to find out what the number on your sheet that is represented the most and then the one that is represented the least. That's kind of a pain and tedious to go through your whole thing and kind of add up which ones you have the most of and which ones you have the least of. Again, it just felt a little bit tedious and not for a very big payoff. It felt kind of like much ado about nothing. So overall, this is a game that I wouldn't say it's a bad roll and write game. It's a perfectly fine game. There will be some people that maybe the theme will be enough to get them over the top, or maybe they haven't played as many roll and write games and they have not seen these types of bonuses or scoring options before. But if you've played a few roll and write games, I really don't think that this is going to do anything you haven't seen before. And for that reason, I cannot recommend Emergency Roll, Dice Hospital. I'm giving it a 5 out of 10. I just feel like it missed the mark. The graphic design is a huge issue. Not very interesting scoring. Not terribly innovative. It just missed the mark for me. All right, well, that's it for me. This is Mike DiLisio signing off from Dice Tower headquarters.